At sunrise, the Colosseum was already throbbing with life. Its towering arches glowed under the first pale streaks of dawn, while yesterday's blood still stained the stone like a shadow that refused to fade. Beneath the stands, vendors shouted for attention, waving baskets heaped with olives and watered wine, preparing for a crowd that hadn't even arrived yet. Beyond the iron gates, handlers forced half-starved beasts into position, lions with ribs poking through their fur, elephants pounding the ground in fury, panthers tearing their claws across the bars. From the tunnels came the piercing clang of swords, not rehearsals, but tests of steel meant for killing. Above it all, a low murmur swelled into a thunderous roar. Tens of thousands of Romans flooding in, ravenous for the one thing their empire perfected better than anyone: death, wrapped in the costume of entertainment. The Roman arena was never just sport. It was a laboratory of cruelty. Emperors flooded the sands with mock sea battles, starved wild animals to stoke suspense, and forced prisoners to reenact myths that ended with real corpses. None of it was by accident. It was policy, tightly woven into Rome's machinery of control. Every cheer from the stands wasn't harmless amusement. It was loyalty, shouted loud enough to echo across centuries. And today we're stepping directly into that shadow. These were the most vicious, most inhumane arena acts that even Rome sometimes found too extreme. From blood-soaked funeral rites to executions staged as theater. The empire built its glory on transforming suffering into applause. The first gladiatorial combat in Rome didn't begin with golden fanfare or emperors draped in purple. It began at a funeral. In 264 BC, the sons of Decimus Junius Brutus Sciava chose not to honor their father with statues or prayers, but with blood. They armed 3 pairs of slaves and ordered them to fight to the death in the Forum Boarium, a cattle market thick with dung and smoke. This was not entertainment. It was duty. An amunus, an obligation owed to the dead. Its roots stretched far beyond Rome. In Campania, warriors were slaughtered at graves to appease restless spirits. Over time, sacrifice twisted into combat. The dead no longer demanded random victims, but chosen jewels of men pitted against one another. The Samnites, once sworn enemies of Rome, staged such contests often, and Roman elites eagerly copied the custom. Burying a man with treasures displayed wealth. Burying him with a blood-soaked spectacle flaunted power. But funerals were only the beginning. By the 3rd century BC, Rome's leaders saw how these fights could do more than honor ancestors. They could steady politics. Religious festivals, once solemn offerings to Jupiter, began featuring gladiators. The Senate disguised it as piety, but the crowd understood the truth. This was state-sponsored violence designed to bind people in loyalty. Even the armor told stories. Early fighters were dressed as Rome's conquered foes: the Samnite with his heavy shield, the Thracian with a curved blade, the Gaul with his broad sword. Watching them bleed was like watching Rome's victories replayed slash by slash. Death became propaganda, and as blood spilled, the venues grew. Wooden stands gave way to massive amphitheaters, temples of violence where thousands gathered. The games no longer belonged to grieving families. They belonged to the state. Every drop of blood whispered the same chilling message. Rome commanded men, armies, even death itself. No one at the time could have imagined how far it would go. What began as ritual sacrifice twisted into performance, and duty turned into obsession. Rome had discovered a new weapon, dominion not only over the living, but over the meaning of dying. Once unleashed, the empire never closed that door, and the roar of the crowd wasn't always for men. Sometimes it thundered for beasts dragged from the farthest edges of the known world. Lions from North Africa, leopards from the Caucasus, crocodiles from the Nile, even giraffes hauled across burning deserts. They weren't displayed as marvels of nature, they were condemned as prey in a carnival of slaughter. Romans called these shows venations, hunts. They weren't about survival, but about domination. Proof that the empire could capture the wild and destroy it for pleasure. Julius Caesar set the tone in 46 BC when he paraded a giraffe, the first ever seen in Europe. They called it a camelopard, half camel, half leopard, because Rome had no word for such a beast. It didn't matter. The animal wasn't celebrated. It was tossed into the arena to be torn apart. The message was brutal but clear. If Rome could seize the strangest creatures alive, then nothing in the world was beyond its grasp. The bloodshed only escalated. When the Colosseum opened in AD 80, Emperor Titus reportedly oversaw the killing of more than 9,000 animals in a single festival. Archaeologists have uncovered bones etched with signs of deliberate starvation, proof that lions and bears were weakened beforehand to ensure a quicker, bloodier kill. Even elephants, once feared by Roman legions under Hannibal, were herded into the arena and butchered for cheers. Behind the spectacle, the logistics themselves became theater. Exotic beasts had to be captured, dragged across deserts, and kept alive just long enough to meet their fate. Caravans rattled chains through scorching sands, fleets ferried cages down the Nile, and handlers risked their lives to deliver living trophies to Rome. Seeing a panther in the wild was terrifying enough, but watching one explode from a cage before 50,000 screaming spectators was power made visible. Each creature was a living souvenir of conquest, proof that Rome's reach had no limits. Some emperors turned these hunts into their personal stage. Commodus, the empire's most flamboyant showman, strutted into the arena dressed as Hercules, slaughtering hundreds of animals himself. He wanted to appear as a god among beasts, but the truth was glaring, a fragile ego hiding behind a bow. The hunts were often rigged, animals chained, crippled, or starved, so the emperor could bask in victory without risk. And the people cheered, not out of admiration, but because silence in the arena could be fatal. Yet behind the applause, a quieter tragedy unfolded. Ancient writers like Pliny the Elder warned that rare species vanished from their homelands after decades of Roman slaughter. Lions, leopards, even elephants, driven toward extinction just to satisfy the empire's hunger for spectacle. The Colosseum was not merely a theater of death. It was an ecological wrecking ball. But for Rome, extinction didn't matter. What mattered was the illusion that nature itself could be trapped, starved, and destroyed for amusement. Each carcass on the sand was another stone in the wall of imperial control. When you imagine a gladiator, you might picture two evenly matched warriors locked in noble combat. The reality was far more twisted. Rome thrived on imbalance, on contests deliberately engineered for cruelty. They built strange weapons, imposed absurd rules, and staged fights no one could truly win. Some victims weren't fighters at all. Prisoners and condemned criminals were shoved into the arena dressed as clowns, handed wooden swords, and pushed to die against seasoned killers. The crowd laughed as the doomed flailed and collapsed. It was public execution dressed up as sport. Even the weapons became characters. The retiarius fought with a fisherman's net and trident, pitted against the secutor, whose smooth helmet was designed to deflect the net. It wasn't about pure skill, it was suspense, a living riddle. Would the net ensnare or would the blade break free? Romans devoured that tension even when the fight was scripted like a play. The scale grew obscene. One gladiator against several foes. Entire units clashing like miniature armies, turning the sand into a swamp of blood, splintered shields, and mangled corpses. And when novelty wore thin, they reached further. Female gladiators. Gladiatresses stepped onto the sand in the 1st century AD. Writers like Juvenal mocked them, yet records show they fought for real, against dwarfs, beasts, even one another. Their presence blurred gender lines but hammered home a darker truth. No one, man or woman, escaped Rome's thirst for spectacle. Even the helmets were tools of torment. Some narrowed vision or muffled sound, forcing fighters to stumble half-blind while the crowd howled with laughter. Others were so heavy that lifting one's head became a contest on its own. Armor wasn't always protection. Sometimes it was punishment, protection. Sometimes it was punishment. And then came the propaganda plays. Gladiators dressed as barbarians, forced to mimic Rome's defeated enemies. Their inevitable loss reminded everyone that the empire always triumphed. Every mismatch, every exotic twist, every gender-bending stunt was engineered to keep the crowd shocked, obedient, and begging for more. The Colosseum never settled for repetition. It invented new cruelties, forever hunting for the next thrill. By midday, once the morning's jewels had soaked the sand and the crowd began to fidget, the arena shifted gears. Combat gave way to theater, with death at center stage. Romans called it damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. For the condemned, it wasn't a trial. It was a script written in blood, and they had no power to refuse. Criminals, deserters, rebellious slaves, prisoners of war. Rome turned them all into unwilling actors in a gruesome theater disguised as myth. Punishment was tailored to crime. Thieves torn apart by wolves, arsonists burned alive, traitors hurled to lions. Every performance was a morality tale written in blood, and the scale could stagger belief. During Emperor Trajan's celebrations after his Dacian victory, thousands of captives were executed over 103 relentless days. It wasn't random bloodshed, it was carefully staged, paced like scenes in a chilling play. Every death was designed to hold the audience in suspense until the next horror emerged. Animals were the stars of this nightmare. Lions starved to frenzy before release, bears chained in pits until provoked into sudden rage, even prized leopards unleashed on helpless victims. The uncertainty, would the beast kill instantly or torment its prey, kept the crowds screaming for more. At times, cruelty wore the mask of legend. Prisoners forced to play doomed heroes, Orpheus ripped apart by beasts, Prometheus chained as vultures circled. These weren't stories anymore. They were blood-soaked dramas with the sand as their stage. Death in Rome wasn't always just death. Sometimes it was mock theater, dripping with cruelty. The condemned weren't simply killed. They had to perform their own demise, embodying Rome's myths with their bodies. Executions became grotesque plays, flesh as masks, agony as script. The cruelty stretched further than wild beasts. Crucifixion, borrowed from the East, was staged inside the arena. Men and women nailed to timber while vendors sold wine and children played nearby. Fire was added too. Victims forced into the tunica molesta, a shirt soaked in pitch set ablaze. Living torches writhing as black smoke curled upward. As Tertullian bitterly described, they were human torches. These killings weren't mere entertainment. They were propaganda, etched into flesh. Defy Rome, and you would die slowly with tens of thousands watching. Not everyone could bear it. Seneca complained that midday executions hardened the soul, teaching men to revel in cruelty. But his protests vanished beneath the thunder of a crowd that came not for justice, but for spectacle. Rome's imagination didn't end with sand and swords. Sometimes emperors demanded oceans conjured within the city. Mock naval battles, naumachii, were staged on an impossible scale, where water itself became a weapon. Julius Caesar set the precedent in 46 BC, digging a massive basin near the Tiber, filling it with water and real ships. Thousands of doomed captives were forced aboard, told to fight as rival fleets. They weren't actors. They were men condemned to die for applause. Arrows, catapults, and blades turned the basin into a floating slaughterhouse. Augustus expanded the madness. In 2 BC, he built a basin nearly 2,000 by 1,200 Roman feet, fed by a special aqueduct, the Aqua Alsiatina, to keep it full. 30 warships clashed there, each packed with prisoners destined never to survive. The message, Rome could summon seas where none existed. Even nature bent to imperial will. By 52 AD, Claudius went further, draining Lake Fucine to stage another naumachia. When captives greeted him with the chilling salute, Morituri te salutant, those who are about to die salute you, history gained one of its most haunting lines. Rehearsed or desperate, it captured the hopelessness of men reduced to props. Fire also carried its myths. Victims in pitch-soaked tunics became unwilling actors in legendary deaths. Hercules consumed by poison, Mucius Scaevola proving loyalty by thrusting his hand into flames. The crowd laughed as these heroes screamed, their stories reduced to mockery and ash. Even the Colosseum's design fed Rome's appetite. Under Titus and later Domitian, engineers carved channels beneath the arena floor so the sand could flood for miniature naval shows, then drain for combat the next day. Cruelty itself became an engineering project. Water, fire, and flesh, every element was a prop in Rome's theater of control. To drown captives, turn bodies into torches, bend myth into slaughter, that was power. Emperors weren't satisfied ruling men. They posed as rulers of the elements themselves. By the late 1st century, executions weren't punishments. They were scripts dripping with creative malice, twisting cultural legends into humiliating deaths. Take the inaugural games of the Colosseum in AD 80. The poet Martial recorded an actor forced to play Orpheus, the musician who charmed beasts with song. In myth, animals sat entranced. In the arena, a bear was released mid-performance and mauled the singer to death. Beauty became butchery. Another victim played Daedalus, the inventor who escaped Crete with wax wings. Suspended on a crude contraption, he soared briefly before plunging into beasts below, Marshall quipped. The man must have wished for real feathers, mocking terror hidden beneath costume. Perhaps most grotesque of all was the myth of Pasiphae, cursed with desire for a bull. One show staged her infamous union with a mechanical beast, followed by an execution that blurred the lines between punishment, humiliation, and pornography. A myth meant as warning became public degradation. The message was unmistakable. Rome owned its legends just as it owned its people. Heroes, villains, kings, queens, none were safe from being remade into props in a pageant of death. For spectators, these scenes were sideshows between contests. For the condemned, they were agony in costume. For Rome, they were propaganda made flesh, proving the empire could even rewrite its myths. In the Colosseum, stories weren't carved in marble or inked on scrolls. They were branded into flesh, burned into bone, and applauded until silence swallowed the sand. The line between rule and obsession blurred until an emperor's whim decided who lived, who died, and how. Caligula, infamous for his savage moods, once ran out of animals mid-show and casually ordered spectators dragged from the stands to replace them. They came to watch bloodshed, only to become part of it. Nero, obsessed with his image, turned the arena into his personal theater. Prisoners forced into roles from tragic plays, executed in ways that mirrored scripted fates. Nero called it art. Rome whispered, madness. And then came Commodus, the ultimate showman emperor. Cloaked as Hercules, he stormed into the Colosseum wielding club and bow, slaughtering animals crippled beforehand to guarantee his victory. He even drained the treasury to fund his performances, forcing cheers from terrified crowds. Not satisfied, he fought gladiators too, always with the odds stacked in his favor. Losing was impossible. Applause was compulsory. Domitian wielded the arena as a weapon of paranoia, staging midnight hunts by torchlight to keep Rome uneasy, never knowing when amusement might twist into terror. Even good emperors weren't exempt. Trajan, remembered as just and capable, marked triumph with 103 days of games. Thousands of deaths folded into celebration. Spectacle fed egos, but the price was high. Caligula and Commodus both died violently, remembered not for leadership, but for theater drenched in blood. The arena that raised them also revealed their madness. Not every Roman cheered. Philosophers, poets, early Christians left behind quieter records, glimpsing decay beneath marble. Seneca confessed that executions hardened him, stripping away compassion. Violence, he warned, seeped beyond the arena walls, poisoning daily life. Cicero, decades before, praised bravery but condemned cruelty for its own sake. Though he admitted the mob demanded games as proof of generosity, to rule meant feeding the beast. For Christians, the amphitheater was persecution made public. Those who refused to renounce faith were hurled to lions or burned alive, their deaths twisted into entertainment. Tertullian called the shows seeds of cruelty, an indictment of an empire that cheered injustice as sport. Economically, the games devoured fortunes. By the empire's later years, rulers bankrupted themselves, chasing spectacles grand enough to outshine their predecessors. What once displayed strength became acts of desperation. Culturally, this appetite dulled Rome's edge. Citizens who once revered discipline now demanded cheap bread and endless circuses. Juvenal mocked this hunger with his phrase panem et circenses. To him, the craving for spectacle revealed how far Rome had strayed from its republican roots. As the frontiers collapsed and coffers dried, the arenas fell silent. By the 5th century, the Colosseum, still massive, stood hollow, its sand empty, its roars gone. But the questions it raised never faded. Could a society that trained its people to delight in cruelty truly endure? History's verdict suggests otherwise. The Colosseum looms today, scarred but imposing. Walk its tunnels and you may still hear echoes, iron clashing, beasts roaring, 50,000 voices rising as one. The stone is easy to admire. Harder and far more honest is to remember its purpose. Cruelty rehearsed until it became normal. Rome's arenas weren't simply about blood. They were about control, shaping how citizens thought, laughed, and obeyed. Every hunt, every execution, every myth reborn in screams served the same end, to make power appear eternal. That warning still lingers, carved into the ruins long after the applause has died.